over the next hour or so. Uh, so what we're talking about is a draft paper called Finding a Corps-Wide Strategic Narrative for Civil Affairs, and then in subquotes, a joint civil affairs Corps project. The background for this is uh, the Civil Affairs Association as the regimental association for the CA Corps, in partnership with the U.S. Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School as the CA proponent, and the U.S. Army Special Operations Command Force Modernization Center CA Capability Manager, U.S. Marine Corps Civil Military Operations School as the Marine Corps CA proponent, and the U.S. Special Operations Command J39 as the joint CA proponent. At the end of December 23, the conference at Fort Liberty, the association talked about drafting a unified strategic narrative on civil affairs. So Chris Holshek and Dennis Cahill have gotten together and put out the first draft, if you will, of what this is going to be. Now, I was taking some notes from Dr. Mann. She gave her presentation, and I'm wondering if we need to tweak the title of this a little bit. Instead of just finding a Corps-wide strategic narrative on civil affairs, maybe it's defining and communicating that same, something to think about. And we also are missing when we're talking about the scope of this, we don't talk about the audience per se. So at the very end of this, maybe we can add paragraphs on the audience and how to tell that story. Those are just a couple of thoughts as well. So just going back, the paper summarizes a common understanding of civil affairs to be used by all civil affairs professionals. What does CA do? Why is CA important? What are the major issues related to CA going forward? And those were the major paragraphs of the paper. The document itself is not meant to be an official document. This is meant to be a standalone effort that is really allowing you to communicate to those target audiences that don't understand the civil affairs Corps, civil affairs narrative. So with that, I think I'll stop there. Hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of what we were attempting to accomplish here, where Chris Holchek and Dennis Cahill have gone to start the work. And then I'm going to turn this over to both, and I'll moderate a little bit between. But the effort is to describe this paper in more depth. Amongst the participants today, we're hoping to get some additional ideas on how we should adapt this this paper and the value of it going forward. This is not meant to be just an elevator talk to a specific kind of audience. It's something that we can talk to any audience with. Although, as Dr. Mann said, you really do have to get inside that cognitive narrative with messaging for each of your target audiences. Okay, so I'll stop here. And Chris, may I turn it over to you first?
Yes, sir. And then I'll turn it over to Dennis. I think inadvertently we at least in the title of this have something kind of sort of right in this idea that we're finding a narrative and explaining what that narrative is through stories and messages and so on. Rather than creating a narrative. I don't think we can create a narrative. We just have to identify what the narrative is. And I think that's why from Dr. Mann's discussion that there's a lot of work to do. We can do something, I think, in the next couple of months that just sort of gets it out there. And then I think it's going to be a very iterative process. A large number of people. And maybe one of the things that we've got to do is create some sort of a venue for people to actually tell their stories. That may be something that we may want to think about doing. And I think the association would be extremely well poised to do that. So we can develop the narrative by creating a space for people to tell their stories, their civil affairs stories. So the other thing that Dr. Mann has told me, and I referenced this in the opening page there later on down towards the bottom, is that that a narrative, another way of looking at a narrative is it's a strategic story. The idea of a strategic narrative is kind of redundant because narratives in general are strategic in nature, because they're sort of overarching. So the idea of of disseminating a narrative, I think that her point about that, I think, makes huge sense. And so I think we've, at least with that understanding, can go forward and 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 refine this process. And I think it's not going to be a short-term thing. I think it's something take a long-term commitment to. But I think the association is very well disposed to do that. That's the good news. And we have people like Dennis and many of the people that Dennis communicates on the panel to, and of course everyone out there to help us out. So we certainly have enough in research. So with that, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Dennis, and I'll flip the slides for you, Dennis.
All right, thanks, Chris. And I think the other piece that Dr. Mann was important is, how we decide to represent that our culture, our narrative to others. As General Van Roosen said, we have to identify the target audience and maybe tailor the story or the narrative, as we speak to different audiences. But if you go to the next slide, and we can probably just skip this. Everybody knows who we are now. And I think this is basically the outline of the paper that Chris put together. And we're going to go into detail. The slides here kind of provide some snippets of what's in the paper in each of these sections. And, Chris and I are going to kind of go back and forth based on some of the parts that we put into it. But
and
Chris,
we drew these questions, guys, from the discussion that we had at the conference, because what was very clearly coming out in the discussion was we need to be able to explain to people what is civil affairs. We need to be able to explain, what does civil affairs do? What do civil affairs? What is and why it's important to whatever the audience is that we're talking, and I think we take a hint at who those audiences are in here, but General Van Roosen's point is very well taken, and we have to be much more specific about those audiences so that people know what messages or what stories to tell which audience. And then the last one we put on, we realized that we've got to at least sort of identify the sort of overarching, continuing issues related to civil affairs as we, move our way forward. Bring the civil affairs. So, with that, back to you.
Chris, next slide. I think the next one has to do. Well, before we get into this, can you go one more slide? And can you just describe the sources?
Yes. What we did here, guys. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but the first three things. I'll tell you this, when Dennis and I started this process, we looked at three things. We looked at the 2022 civil affairs value proposition that's unpublished, but it's a great information paper, because it sort of explains what the value of civil affairs is. So we leaned very heavily on that. The other thing that we looked very much at, because again, to a different audience, I mean, the civil affairs information paper is basically coming from the proponent level, and it's basically explaining to the customers of civil. The other document at the more strategic level is the Defense DoD Directive 2013, which is in the process currently under revision as a DoD. So we're looking forward to seeing that. But we thought that that did a really good job of explaining at the strategic level and to non-civil affairs, non-military officers, because they obviously work in the interagency level. You know, we borrow very heavily from there as well. And then the third thing we did, if you remember, and if I need to, I can bring that slide up. But if you remember back in December, what I had done in one slide was I sort of summarized what were the main messages, or the main findings, I should say, not the main outtakes, the main findings, main takeaways from all 10 years of the Civil Affairs issue paper. And so we looked at those because here's the thing. The thing that we realized is that a narrative isn't, or even, you know, identifying the narrative isn't simply reciting policy and doctrine. FM 357, another source, very, very heavily leaned on. But at the same time, we realize that a narrative isn't just something that comes from, you know, policy and doctrine. Because if you're going to just simply recite policy and doctrine, then we're not really sure why we're doing this. Anyway, because we can just tell everybody to cite the policy and doctrine. And we know that that's not satisfactory, because if it was satisfactory, we wouldn't be trying to get our arms and our brains around this problem of trying to explain to ourselves and to explain to the people that we do business with, the people that we want to be putting civil affairs, Congress or whatever, you know, what civil affairs is, what it does, and why that's important. It's national security and all these different things. We know that that doesn't just come out of these sort of dry documents that come from office, that go through a great deal of tweaking and refinement, but from the sorts of platforms that we here at the association have, the events like this, the association civil affairs papers themselves. These are forums in which people can kind of begin to articulate in more common or common sense terms what is civil affairs, what does it do, all these. So so these are all things that you know, Dennis and I have been looking at to put this thing together. We realized that when we put this paper together, we were going to go right straight forward into the deliverables, which is basically the presentation that we have, the sort of strategic communications briefing that we developed with all the speaking notes, and then we're looking at a flyer, and we're looking at other things, but it's not just about creating products. And so we realized that we've got to have at least some sort of a working. That's really what this is. It's not, you know, oh, here are the 10 commandments, and now go out and recite. We realized we wanted to make sure that we identified certain things that are descriptive of what civil affairs is and so on, that people can use and adapt in their own language, in their own settings, in their own environments, to their own specific audiences. What is kind of a tall order that we're doing. So this is the paper that you're looking at is really the result of this process so far. And then once we sort of think we've got this more or less, then over the summer we thought, well, we're going to take a crack at updating the in the fall, and that's really kind of our way forward. Very, very cool. So, Dennis, back to you.
All right, Chris, if we can go back one slide. I think we've already covered most of this here. And one important point, you know, General Van Roozen kind of tasked us to be the primary authors, but the intent was to make this a joint initiative, bullet number 2 in the background, between the CA Association and the various proponents within our core. Yeah. And our MO is we write the initial draft, we share it, and then we will make some heavy edits as we get input from everybody.
Yeah.
And I think most of the other stuff here was also already discussed. I'm looking over into the chat, and I see that, for example, Dale Mark Benedict talks about addressing what civil affairs has done. He talks about various iterations of CA and CIMIC, highlighted post-World War II. And, we don't really go into detail in the version that we put out this morning about the origins of civil affairs. I have a separate paper that you and I shared with you, Chris, early on, where I have about 4 paragraphs that kind of go into, the Lewis and Clark expedition as the first early use of military forces to
do strategic civil reconnaissance.
Right, deliberately seek information about social, cultural, political, economic, physical conditions. Talks about the examples of Army and Marine Corps forces in occupation duties throughout the late 1800s, early 1900s. Of course, a little bit about World War II, Operation Torch, and then all the way through the occupation of both countries in both European and Pacific theaters, Vietnam and Accords. And then a little bit about what forces have done over the last 20, 30 years from, Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia, Kuwait, and a whole bunch of stuff. So we don't really have that in the paper, the version that we have, that we provided this morning. Perhaps we can put some of that, because that, I think, is a lot of the source of our narrative that Dr. Mann was talking about. Tony Baja mentions that he doesn't see a key source that was written by Sam Hayes and Ken Nguyen a few years back, their NPS study. And Tony, the reason why is because we didn't really have that available, and Chris and I need to get a hold of that. I think Dr. St. Benoit also mentioned Sam Hayes and the work he's done. So that is something that we were remiss and have to circle back to. I know Sam and Ken were the first ones I recall pointing to Lewis and Clark, as that early civil reconnaissance mission. And of course, in their paper, they recommended the Cross Pipe Hawks, which kind of came out of that. So I know a little bit about it. We don't have the details. I think we have to go back and integrate that into the next iteration.
Hey, Dennis, I'll see. I think I have it somewhere. I'll dig through, my sources and see if I can get it to you guys.
Well, certainly what I think we need to do is again, I'm responding also to Chris Stockel and Tracy. Please, if Dennis and I will make sure we post our emails in the chat and send us this stuff. Because Dennis and I are kind of, we're both co-editors. We're not really creators as much as we are editors in this process. So if you have input for us, we are very, very happy to get it. Because we don't want to be working in a vacuum. We want to be, if you're aware of something that was done, by all means, please send it to me and Dennis, and we will definitely inform.
And Chris, this initial draft isn't very long. We didn't really discuss how long should it be. I mean, there could be a whole lot of information in there. And ultimately, actually, as you have said, the strategic narrative, the strategic communication package, the slides are also a companion to this, and maybe more of that information will reside there. But we haven't discussed how long should this be and that kind of stuff. So we can work that. But if you can go to the next slide, and I think some of what the next slides we'll get into will answer Colonel Kuhlman's comment about the unique capability that we provide to DoD. And this section here is kind of one that I I tackled. And of course, what is civil affairs is the big question, the one that everybody asks. And we've been asking this question for years and have been pretty much given different answers that never seem to satisfy anybody. And of course, the words in this document still may not satisfy everyone. But as far as getting down, that's what I was asking Dr. Mon. How do we, make this a simple statement that we can all agree with? I was hoping that the first two bullets here kind of get to the essence of what it is that civil affairs is in simple terms. And we look at it in terms of capability. The DoD Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms defines capability as the ability to complete a task or execute a course of action under specific conditions and level of performance. And, if we look at standard military formations that are organized, man-trained, and equipped primarily for armed combat against our nation's enemies, I think there's a capability gap there. There's a definite capability gap when it comes to those forces understanding and integrating the civil component of the operational environment into their operations across the competition continuum. And so we say that civil affairs is the only DoD capability, organized, man, trained, and equipped to address that gap of understanding and integrating the civil component. It's a capability specifically focused, and I highlighted or I italicized these words in here for emphasis. CA is specifically focused on understanding the civil environment, or more accurately, the civil component of the operational environment, and actually engaging the civilians in that operational environment for the express purpose of creating specific conditions that lead to the achievement of not just military objectives, but political and military objectives. And to do that, this capability is composed of people who do these things in the second bullet. And we meant to add the word C to the second list of italicized words. But CA capability is composed of people who see, understand, engage, and influence the human dimension of conflict. And I think this kind of supports the four core competencies that are outlined in the current civil affairs doctrine. Later and throughout the paper, we describe how civil affairs forces can only do this by coordinating and networking with interagency, interorganizational, and local civilian mission partners. And as far as we can see, no other part of the joint force actively seeks to support, organize, or work with civilian partners for this purpose, either during periods of competition or in the midst of large-scale combat operations. And the other point we wanted to make about civil affairs is the type of forces that make up the DoD capability. And that's the part in black here. Today, the capability only resides in the Army, U.S. Army, and U.S. Marine Corps, and is broken down, as you see in these three sub-bullets. Active Army CA forces, designated as Special Operations Forces, primarily supporting in semi-permissive or denied areas. It's also composed of U.S. Army Reserve CA forces designated as conventional and primarily supporting, but not necessarily, exclusively, but primarily supporting conventional maneuver forces, civilian partner organizations, and host nation authorities when they are mobilized for that purpose. And finally, it consists of U.S. Marine Corps CA forces that are broken out basically in their active component as civil military operations staff officers and reserve component CA units that support U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Navy formations. And we recently had an updated set of slides from Ted Yintema from the Marine Corps Civil Military Operations School that delineates those three, correction, on the Marine Corps, those pieces of the active, what the active looks like and what the reserve currently looks like. So are there any questions about this? There's more paragraphs in this section, but that's kind of the essence of what this section contains at the moment. Over.
By the way, one of the things that we did, Dennis and I, before, I think we did on the paper, but we didn't do here, was we added the word see, see, understand, engage, and influence, because of that implies the civil reconnaissance. Very important civil.
Okay, if there's no question, then let's go ahead and well, I didn't check. There's a bunch of messages in the
Yeah, I'm
chat.
checking them too.
Yeah, Dennis. So you've got a couple of things that have come up. You've got Chris Stockel has added a couple of references for possible utilization in this. You've got civil period soldiers become governors. You've got War and the Art of Governance by Nadia Shaklau, Robin Rowan. And then, of course, Warrior Diplomat, Civil Period Forts in the Front Line, which is a very good recent addition. You've also got Earl Coleman mentioning that Marine Corps is not just civil affairs, but they're a mixture now of information operations, SUP, and CA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Marines, have very much incorporated the idea of civil affairs as an information.
Well, it also gives us the whole question of, is the narrative enough for us to stick with, or do we also need to take that to the point where we've added in discussions about the audience, who to say it to, and how to tell the story. So, not just what to say, but adding the who and the how.
Yeah. And that's what Dennis and I have tried to do. We've tried to kind of capture the main ideas in response to each of these questions, and then give some granularity to that. The other questions of who does those things.
And Colonel Kuhlman is right, about the World War II lessons. And it's funny, I constantly hear people telling us we need to forget World War II. We're not going to do occupation anymore. The military government, that's not going to happen yet. Or the kinds of things that civil affairs detachments did, both with maneuver as well as post-conflict in the occupation, we have seen again. And I would love to get the vignette of northern Syria, the guys from Charlie Company or the 96th CA Battalion, and how they helped. Was it Raqqa? I think it was Raqqa. Again, they saw similar things, actually supporting the reestablishment of the host nation, local government, while combat operations were still going on not too far away. And so I appreciate that, and we'll work that in there as well.
I think one of the things I'm going to say at this point, and here's kind of for all of you people that are identifying this kind of stuff, we certainly have a couple of platforms on telling the civil affairs story on a story like this, exactly the story you're relating, Dennis. Somebody needs to write an article about it and put it in the Eunomia Journal that tells the story and reflects back to, they had a V8 moment and realized, that the same thing that these guys encountered in World War II were the same thing we're encountering today.
Yeah, it looks like Sergeant Major Perez just put something there that might answer the mail on that one. Consulting engaged in Northeast Syria. I haven't seen that article, but I'd love to look at it. So, Chris, if we can go ahead to the next slide then.
Yep.
And I believe this was one that you were going to lead discussion on.
Right. So that this was a question that really came out a lot in December in the discussions. What does civil affairs actually do? And I think our interagency friends were really onto this. Because and somebody has to be able to explain it in terms that they would understand. And so the main things is that, yeah, as Dennis has paraphrased here, it enables mission command, it increases a situational understanding, it preserves combat power. It's what I tried to do in that particular part is to go to how it's deeply rooted in basically the military government, mission, and then the stabilization mission or post-conflict state. And so civil affairs has sort of evolved from this. I mean, it's evolved from the sort of very storied military government mission, and then in the last few years, it's taken on a lot of other, the sort of winning without fighting and being able to do help out with security cooperation and securing the victory not just after major conflict, but even before it to in fact avoid the major conflict to begin with. So the role of civil affairs in like irregular warfare and between that's another thing that we talked about is how civil affairs sort of works a lot of spaces between irregular and conventional war. We've got soft, we've got conventional civil affairs, and yet we work both between those two things. I remember one of the revelations that of all people, General Van Roosen made of National Defense University a few years ago is this people were sort of still agonizing over the so-called divorce. Is let's get over the fact, let's not look at our diversity as an issue. Let's look at our diversity as a strength. I think one of the things that if I was explaining in very basic terms about what civil affairs does, is it helps commanders understand complexity. It helps commanders understand complex, operational spaces that they work in, and especially with respect to human dimension. And so, by doing all of these different things, by conducting civil reconnaissance, engagement, civil net, integration, support to civil administration, all these things. So we did have a citation there because it's very nicely put in FM 3-57. We plan, coordinate, execute, and assess actions to enhance awareness and amend the interaction of the environment. So on. The other thing that we did, and this is something I think is going to need this idea of help fulfill our responsibilities. I remember previous versions of the FM that went a lot into this at the very beginning. The importance of international law, and for framing civil. It's in the FM still, but it's just not as pronounced as it was, back in the 80s or so. And I thought that was interesting. Because obviously there has to be a sort of legitimacy to it. So yeah, we're there to help protect civilians. We're there to maintain, minimize harmful effects of military operations on the civilian population, the civilian harm and those different things discussed earlier. But we're also there to minimize the civilian interference in military operations. My only comment to that part of it would be is that um, that's assuming a sort of big war scenario. Um, that's sort of going back to sort of World War II and more conventional, uh, uh, conventional interpretations of warfare. Um, but the thing that we're seized with, in many ways, why we've become even more irrelevant and important than we have ever, is because the population is in fact the battle. They are the center of gravity of a lot of modern war. And so how to work that? I mean, we're watching, all of us, with great interest what's going on in Gaza, where you have this sort of juxtaposition of high intensity military operations with the population. Population is itself the center of gravity. So how do you kind of square that? So I think that this is, and I'm only introducing this because this idea of complexity. I think that's something that we can maybe root out, uh, finding sort of common ways of explaining what civil help people sort of explain the complexity dimension in military in terms that they can understand, or when we're working with U.S. Embassy, in terms that they can understand. So we have to be able to speak languages. Any questions?
Chris, I think it's important to, again, to emphasize where you got these from. Looks obviously FM 357 was a major source. I think you also used the info paper on the value proposition.
Yes, we did. Yes, and also the outtakes from the civil affairs papers. The idea of talking about consolidating gains and so on.
And I guess we don't really go into specific examples in the paper about how we do these things, but I think generally, though, looking at this list, I believe it ties back to what I had on that earlier slide, the first bullet, about what is civil affairs. I think these all support the statement that civil affairs, seeks to understand the civilian environment, engage the civilian component, and create conditions to achieve objectives. So I'd like to, not right now, but ultimately get people's feedback on, can that first bullet summarize what it is that civil affairs is, and does everything else support that? But let's go ahead and move on, because we've got little time.
Okay, this is something, Dennis, I think you can explain.
Yeah, I was going to take this one because I kind of I'm the one who put these particular bullets together, and these principles, as I call them right now, are not currently found in any single document. I pretty much drew them from several sources of, the several sources of inspiration listed in that that first slide where Chris outlined all the different sources, and we distilled these through some points of contact listed in a different paragraph. But our doctrine folks will tell you that we already have a list of 8 branch principles in chapter 1 of FM 357, and according to that chapter, the branch principles provide, and I'm quoting here, provide comprehensive and fundamental rules or assumptions of central importance that guide how CA approaches and thinks about the conduct of operations, and captures the broad and enduring guidelines for the employment of CA forces. And I don't necessarily mean to supersede the principles that are listed in FM 357, and maybe principles itself is not the right word for what's listed on this slide. But some of the references that on strategic narrative, writing a strategic narrative, that I read during the research, referred to outlining the enduring values shared by the members of an organization. And I think Dr. Mon also kind of addressed that this morning. So this section was supposed to be enduring values, but I didn't think the word values applied to the items on this list. You know, maybe something more like truths or tenets would be a better word, and we're open to suggestions there. But the bottom line is, I think this list can nest with the principles outlined in 357, not completely compete with them, but it also, in my mind, 357 is the doctrine piece. This, I would hope, is in more plain English about the kinds of things that we all agree influence or should be considered when we plan and conduct civil affairs operations. So open up to any discussion on that. Over.
Well, one thing I would say, just from what you just said, Dennis, and then I'll turn it over to anybody who has any to add, is when Colonel Ives pointed out this morning this idea of civil affairs or civil affairs operations being a soft activity, regardless who's doing it, regardless if it's conventional CA or off CA or whatever your compo is, or even the Marines. I mean, I think that's very helpful because one of the things I've always done, and I think a lot of folks have done in their careers, is use the soft truths and imperatives. And so I think we can more comfortably adopt those many ways to explain a lot of what we do because they are already very well instituted. And I think that that's something that we could not. I'm not trying to say that this would replace these enduring principles, but I think that we can incorporate the soft truths and imperatives into that of how we do, not only what we do, but how and why we do it. Over to anybody on the floor. Just raise your mic and.
Yeah, Chris, this is you. A couple items have come up in the chat that probably should be added. If you're looking at enduring principles, the idea of having a touch point to coordinate with not just civilians, but with agencies, Department of State, USAID, other entities, European.
Yeah, I think that's covered in the last bullet.
Okay, Colonel Coleman is again pointing out that there's no mention in these principles about transition governance, but it is discussed in the paper.
Right. So the military governance requirement under Title 10 also probably needs to be highlighted somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, sir, and Chris, this is Tony Vaha. So I think one of the things that we continually stumble on as a branch is we define ourselves introspectively versus externally. So a lot of our language becomes very jargony. I think the civilian entities understand us better than the military entities, right? So we don't have a problem going to CIMIC or all these different entities. Where we have a problem is defining to maneuver commanders.
Yeah.
In many instances, and Green Beret commanders. So sometimes the jargon and I'll be generous to my former comrades in SWCC at CA Doctrine. Sometimes we define these terms and they become our own hyper metastasized terms that when we go to translate them in maneuver places, they just don't know what we're talking about, quite frankly. So when I look at FM 357, a lot of times, the jargon that we're using may sound good to each of us because we understand what it's about. It's just when we go to translate that to the big army or the big joint force that it comes across very obtuse. Over.
Tony,
That's
I think you
interesting
hit on,
comment.
yeah, you hit on an important thing. And one of the comments we got back was, why do we need to go through this whole exercise here? Why don't we just use FM 357 sort of as the narrative? And my comment back was I couldn't really find there's a lot of stuff in there, and I couldn't really find anything that concisely describes the narrative. But as we said earlier, this is not necessary to supersede doctrine, but it's to help us as a core better explain to us without using our doctrinal references. Over.
Yeah, I mean that this is we're trying to do here is to explain the things that there are policies and doctrines don't explain, but at the same time, we want to reference them, we want to acknowledge them, we want to bring them in as much as we can, because obviously what that is doing is when we explain these things that we can show whoever it is that we're talking to, this is grounded. This isn't stuff we're just making up. It's grounded in power. And in our experiences, and that this idea of storytelling is super important. But I think that what we were trying to do very much in paper, it's interesting, Tony, because we were very keeping very much in mind the maneuver commander as we were writing this. But I do agree that we tend to kind of preach to the choir, and this is what we're not trying to do here. Is we're trying to be able to praise a lot of this stuff so that it lands with people outside of the civil affairs. So your point is well taken.
So, Chris, I guess we can go on to the next one.
Okay.
Which, yep, this was your slide.
Yeah, and I've started to do this. I started in that particular part of it to just do this. Hey, look, what is it? Why is because we are the unique national capability that helps to not only win, but end and prevent wars in other ways than just than just kinetics. And this idea of securing the victory. Is super important in explaining there's something that we have that's really that's part of our narrative is and explain what secure the victory is. But I think as of late, the idea of secure the victory was only something that happened in post-conflict stabilization, and that's because War II and all that. But you can secure the victory, during competition, or you can secure the victory during conflict prevention. So we try to kind of explain that, as Dennis was at the beginning of his presentation, we're a unique force in many different ways because we do all of these different things that other parts of the force are not really designed to do, as well as civil. This idea that we help to strengthen alliance and attract. Remember, we had I remember the former head of DISA years ago, explaining how CA is so vitally important when we talk about building global civil networks and so on. We build networks, and networks are super important if you're going to win. And we are a premier economy of force capable in preserving combat power and blood and treasure that's entrusted to those commanders. And many of us have explained that, getting to the maneuver commanders. Look, sir, we're providing you a better way of winning, without having to commit your combat power. We want to preserve your combat power for what it's really designed to do. But if we can structure the battlefield in such a way that we're going to win without having to combat power or risk things that we would otherwise want to risk, then, that's, we're a huge add-on to any command. So, that's kind of what we tried to do. We tried to explain that sort of strategically. We tried to explain that operationally and tactically.
Chris, Dr. Mon
But if you
mentioned
were
that.
sitting at a congressional, meeting, I think we tried to do that too. We wanted to show why we were important national security, not sort of in the operational doctrinals.
Chris, I was going to say, Dr. Mon mentioned, that we develop our narrative from the stories we hear and we tell. And I think you drew these from a lot of this was your review of the issue papers and other sources. Is that correct?
Yeah, not just the issue papers, but this is where this is where I paid a lot of attention to that language that was coming out of that process, that the dialogue that we've had over the last 10 years. A lot of really good things have come out of that help explain, our value in more sort of common sense, more communicable ways than just, this is why you don't just cite the back. Any comments on that? Getting a lot of comments in the chat. We continue. Okay, so wait a minute. What are the issues going forward? Dennis, you want to take this or should I?
No, I'll do it. So each of these challenges, again, is briefly described in the last part of the paper. And, the first three are related and they're related and they're points that Major General Van Ruzen, Major General Richie Moore, and I, among others, have routinely brought up at one point or another, at CA symposiums and roundtable discussions over the past several years. There's been a lot of discussion, but to date, there's really been no concrete action by the organizations responsible for developing the solutions to those particular challenges. So they remain challenges. And likewise, the fourth and fifth bullets have repeatedly been highlighted in past forums with no real resolution. And perhaps solving the first three will lead to solving the last two. But from what we've read, and again, I think reinforced by Dr. Mon's talk this morning, the strategic narrative is supposed to generate innovation, invite action, and catalyze transformative change for the organization. And the paper concludes by outlining a few things the expanded Civil Affairs Corps must do to continue to secure the victory into the future. It points to some potential solutions that require some reprioritization and innovation that come from both within and outside the force. But to get there, we must all agree on the direction that we need to go. And we must aggressively tell our stories, as Dr. Mon again said this morning. We must tell this story over and over again so that others will learn and hopefully agree with what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and at the end of the paper, I quoted General Sontag in that he made that point to us a few years back around the time of just before the 100th anniversary of Civil Affairs, is no one can tell our story better than we can. And it's really kind of an inherent part of our mission as CA professionals, whether we're, past, we're retired people or whatever, but that we're people, serving right now. And again, from whatever corner of the regiment you come from, we have to keep telling our story. So I guess what we're just trying to do here is in this exercise is to kind of provide what the elements of that story might be. What are some of the points that you want to get? that again, we're not trying to create an elevator speech. We're not trying to create something for people to recite. We're just trying to capture the main ideas using phraseology that would seem to work, and let people then take that and adapt it to whatever, as Dr. Mann was saying, the narrative is being able to explain your meaning and place in the environment that you're in. And so this isn't necessarily a narrative, but it's again, it's kind of capturing the elements of the narrative and then allowing people to just take that forward when they're writing a staff paper, or they're writing, or they're just explaining to somebody, what civil affairs that they can do. That's really what Dennis and I are trying to do. We realize that I think Dennis does a really nice job of, in this particular slide, of kind of capturing what we think are not necessarily these are all the issues that we have to deal with, but these are just some of the more important ones, or some of the ones that are enduring. I mean, I made mention when I wrote that page that there are a lot of things in Colonel Hunt's report that are still missing. That's 100 years later. Now, we don't have a permanent CA, staff officer as the D9 in the Army is not even D9 anywhere else is civil affairs, military affairs, but the G9 in the Army is, or the J9 at the Joint Staff. These are still issues that, one of the things I think going forward as we get into multi-component operations, and to finally figure this thing out about Title 10 budget authority, so that we can bring Compo 3 people on, especially when we're doing these multi-component teaming operations, and we're bringing in 38 Gulf, so we're bringing in just reserve component conventional civil, because I think the thing, and I think maybe that, Dennis, as we go forward, we want to maybe one of the things we can try to get at is, what are the comparative advantages of all of these different parts of this very diverse, so that when you're going forward into a GCC or an SCC or a joint task force, and they're looking at you and saying, okay, so how should we task organize civil affairs? Why do we want to bring forward these 38 Gulf? What do they do? What's special about it? So what is it that the CA guys from the conventional side, the reserve component side, can do that, the soft guys can, and so on. It's comparative advantages, and arraying them in such a way when you're doing force planning, so that you can get the best bang for the buck from that force. And I think that would help us realize this idea that General Van Roosen brought up years back, that let's stop, let's look at our diversity as a strength, but how do we go ahead, and leverage that? Something that we, at least from a narrative perspective, begin to at least provide a formative argument.